Welcome back to another edition of Inwarp Mag. I am Brooke, joined as always by my co-host Drew.
Hey, everybody. I'm glad to be back for another episode. What are we talking about this week, Brooke?
We are going to be talking about beginner 40K list building and try to introduce people into just the basics of list building in 40K 10th edition. If you already know what you're doing and you already are a proficient list builder, this might not be the episode for you, but keep listening. You might hear something new that you were not considering.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue from the episode we did a couple weeks ago, which we talked about the different point, like army size games that you can run. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, check it out. I think it's a good one to listen to first before you listen to this episode. So let's get right into it, Brooke.
Yeah, so there's certain aspects that you need to be aware of when building an army in Warhammer 40K. So the first thing you need to consider is the game size that you're going to be playing. And like Drew said, refer back to our previous episode. We talked a lot about point values and which ones we like and reasons to consider different game sizes. There's boarding actions, which kind of has its own unique requirements. There's combat patrol, it's very beginner friendly. Incursion, which is 1,000 points. Strike force, which is 2,000 points, and onslaught, which is 3,000 points.
Yeah, so for today, we're really going to be talking mostly about incursion and on up. If you are like boarding actions curious, we'll probably do like a separate video sometime to talk about how you would build a boarding actions list.
Yeah, definitely. So after you've determined what game size you want to play, and again refer back to our old video from last week or 2 weeks ago now. You're going to be wanting to choose your faction. And your faction could be anything from I like the way this faction looks, or you might be considering the playstyles that each faction has.
Yeah, so what are some of the different playstyles from each faction, would you say, Brooke?
So from like a high level, there's shooting heavy factions, there's melee focused factions, and then there's some balanced factions. There's some other variety in there, but that's kind of generally what flavors of factions are in the game.
Okay, so like if I wanted to be more of a melee focused faction, I might run something like orcs or world eaters or something like that. Those are the two that come to my mind immediately for things that are going to be beating you in the face. So,
Right.
or shooting heavy factions, what would that be like? Tau?
Tau, you have Astra Militarum. There's some other ones in there, but there's some factions like Space Marines that can skew one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Those are mostly considered the balanced factions, but as a Space Wolf player, I can run very heavy melee, so I can run a very melee focused army, or I could run a very shooty heavy army if I wanted to skew that way. But there are balanced factions like the Space Marines and Necrons, where you can kind of get a little bit of everything.
Yeah, so like a balanced faction would be good if you don't want to make a decision between being shooting heavy or melee focused. The good thing about like if you did go into either one, there are some options. You're just not going to have as many options as like the balanced factions like Space Marines.
And not having options is not always a bad thing. It might kind of give you direction on how you take your faction.
Mm-hmm.
Especially as a new player, you might not know what you want to do with your faction. And if you have a ton of decisions to make with something like Space Marines, you might get into this kind of decision paralysis where you're not sure, oh, do I want to buy a tank or do I want to buy assault intercessors or what? You might be in this middle zone where you're not really sure what you want to do. But if you pick a faction that kind of already has an identity, you can be kind of guided down whether it's your collection that you're building or what you want to um, how you want to play the game. You're kind of guided in a direction from the start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ultimately, you really got to go with whatever you think is cool in the end. So I think that's always the most important. But like, I could see where if the playstyle doesn't sound appealing to you, you might pick the second coolest thing.
Right.
All right.
And so once you've chosen your faction, you're going to be choosing your detachment, and that comes from either your codex if your book has come out, or your index, which is what you were granted at the very beginning of the edition. And then every faction got an index during the Grotmas release that happened last Christmas.
So like, what is the detachment for people who don't understand? Like, what does detachment mean? What does it mean to once you've chosen your faction? What does the detachment mean to your play style?
So the detachment is what's going to give your army its flavor or theme. Generally, it will give you extra rules. It'll give you a unique set of stratagems. It will make your army synergize in a unique way, but it kind of takes your faction and then further segregates it into a different play style or maybe even a different theme altogether. There's a
Hmm.
ton of different detachments for certain factions like Space Marines, whereas if you play something like Tau, there's only a few detachments. I think there's 5 total with the new Gratmas detachment that was released. So, if you're wanting to play a given faction, it might be good to explore some of those detachments and see kind of what play styles that they give you within that faction.
And I think an important thing to know about detachments is the rules of the detachment may incentivize you to take certain units. So I think orcs is like maybe the easiest one to show you how they incentivize different units. We have one detachment which is Cult of Speed, and it's all about taking quick vehicles. There's going to be specific units that have the Cult of Speed keyword. I can't remember. Speed Freaks, I think, is what it is, and
Yeah. Hmm.
it incentivizes you taking those units. Versus if you do like the Dread Mob, there's things that are going to be like mechs and stuff like that, and walkers, and it incentivizes you to take those types of units. So that is kind of exactly what you're saying, where it will inject flavor and theme into your faction and the way you play it.
Right.
So is there
And
anything else? Oh, go ahead.
yeah, so the last thing that you need to consider when building your list is you need to, and you don't necessarily need to, but we encourage you to look up the balanced data slate from GW. They have it on their community site. They have a downloads page, and in the downloads page, there's like a core rules section that has the balanced data slate, as well as I think it's the Munitorum field manual, which is all the points. And then there's the errata and stuff like that. But we encourage you to play with those rules because those rules are going to be reflected in apps that you look at later.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's good to take advantage of the latest balancing and stuff to the game, because there could just be, if you played, with the day one rules and you never took these into account, then your buddy who's playing Eldar is going to be kicking you in the teeth for the
Right.
entirety of 10th edition, which wouldn't be fun. So definitely, it's a good idea to consider balanced data slate, because it'll kind of determine what units you end up bringing. Like, as an example, if you didn't do balanced data slate, you would be taking everything that has dev wounds as a keyword,
Right.
because it would be broken still if you were playing day one rules.
Right. Well, we've covered kind of the core concepts of army building. How about we jump into more of a detailed explanation?
Yeah, so I think what we're going to talk about next is just kind of like the step by step process of building an army. So, this is if you have like a list builder tool or something like that, or if you're just doing it manually on paper, which don't recommend. We'll get into that later. These are the steps you would take to actually build the army, kind of according to the codex and or the core rules of how you would build an army. So step one is picking your army size. As we said, in a typical Warhammer 40K game, when you're doing list building, it is going to be either 1,000 point, 2,000 point, or 3,000 point. So that is the very first step. You have to decide how many points you have to spend on your list.
If you aren't sure of what game size you want to play, you can check out our video from our last episode on that. Or kind of if you want to just know where to get started without having to watch anything,
Mm-hmm.
we probably would recommend of the 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000, just go to 2,000. Or if you're very, very, very beginning and you don't have a collection, go to 1,000.
Yep. So step two is going to be selecting your units. So kind of before selecting your units, you're going to pick a detachment. So one of your like 5 or 6 detachments, or um, your index detachment, whichever you have available. And then this is when we can start considering what units we want to bring. But there are some requirements for what you can bring with your units. So do you want to go ahead and cover those requirements for us, Brooke?
Right. So every detachment can only have, by default, 1 leader per unit. There are certain uh, leaders and leader combos that can kind of break that rule, but there's only 1 leader per unit. which is a character that you can attach to a unit that it can lead, which we'll talk about here in a second. You cannot have any duplicate enhancements. So enhancements are something that your detachment gives you access to, and you can pay a few points to add those to a character, a non-epic character. And then the last thing is just your point cap, meaning if you're playing 2,000 points, your total points on your list cannot exceed 2,000. And then there's also slot caps per unit type. So like battle line and transports. Well, which specific transport is that called? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Dedicated transport, so you can have up.
Right.
I can do this part real quick. So
Yeah.
these are like the minimum requirements before you can say it is a valid list. So you have to have at least one character, and he's going to be your warlord. Or if you have multiple characters, you get to choose who your warlord is going to be. And you can have up to 3 of the same data sheet unless it is an epic hero. You can only have 1 epic hero. So you can't have 3 Gazghouls running out there bashing things, no matter how cool that would be. Maybe if you were doing a narrative campaign, you could say Gazghoul got cloned and you got to fight 3 of them. But anyways, for normal Warhammer, one epic hero, and then as Brooke was saying, 6. You can have up to 6 battle line units or 6 dedicated transports.
And yeah, so like you can have, speaking of characters, like you can have 3 basic characters. Like I could have 3 Space Marine captains, but I can't have 3 Ragnar, which is an epic character. So yeah. Anyways, we can move on.
Yeah, and when it comes to leaders, I want to go touch back on that. What you were saying, you have to like look at the data sheets to determine what leaders can be attached to what units, because leaders, like characters, can't lead every unit. So you have to look at the data sheets for the individual units to determine what they can lead. And then most of the data sheets, when you were saying like leaders will be attached to one unit, there are, like you said, things that break those rules, but the data sheets will say it. So like boys, for instance, in orcs, if you have 20 boys, you can attach 2 leaders to that unit.
Right. And in Space Marines, one of the different ways to attach leaders is if you have a captain in the lieutenant data sheet, it says specifically that you can attach a lieutenant to a unit that already has a captain, but only if it is a captain. So meaning I could attach a lieutenant with Ragnar, who is listed as the captain because he has that keyword. So I could have a lieutenant in Ragnar leading a group of Blade Guard vets.
Yep. So one of the things that you're going to do, this is kind of step 3, when you're selecting it kind of goes in hand with step 2, really. You're really going to want to consider the enhancements and stratagems that are available to your detachment, because it's really going to affect what units you bring. Because you don't want to run Def Dread, for instance, or Dread Mob, for instance, for orcs, and then, which is, walkers and mechs and mech boys and stuff like that. You don't want to run that and then take a bunch of not walkers and mechs. Like, it wouldn't make sense, because if you read your specific stratagems and enhancements and stuff like that, it's going to incentivize you to take those units, because there's going to be really good synergies that make your list do work in a game.
Right. You need to consider your stratagems very highly in your list building. You need to read those, because a lot of times I've seen it where a faction detachment, their power comes from their stratagems. So there are certain stratagems that kind of make the detachment sing, whereas other detachments, the rules within their detachment rule makes their detachment sing, instead of having to use stratagems to kind of get that synergy to kick off. So make sure you read those, make sure you understand kind of what they're doing for you, because that synergy will help you maybe decide on what units you want to include.
Yeah, and as a beginner, this can be the hardest part of list building, because it can take a while for you to fully understand the impact of your stratagems. Enhancements are important too, but they're a lot less important than your unit composition and then the stratagems and how they interact with your units. From when I play, usually enhancements are just like, I got 10 points left over that I have nothing to do with, so I'm going to get an enhancement. Is that kind of how you feel about enhancements, Brooke?
Um, I'm a little in between. With my faction, I run Champions of Rust mostly, and one of the enhancements gives my captain, which I typically equip him with the Black Death, and it makes him kind of a vehicle killing machine. So it enables my army to have an answer to vehicles
Mm-hmm.
on a unit that typically doesn't have an answer to vehicles, um, and kind of gives me synergy that I otherwise wouldn't have unless I did consider that enhancement. I can say that for certain lists like demons, they have a lot of auras on their, like, I'm mostly talking about Slanesh demons here because that's one of our friends runs Slanesh demons.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of auras on their enhancements that you need to consider that will help keep your army alive or synergize or give buffs. That those enhancements are very important to the detachment.
Yeah. So it really is comes down to the faction and detachment then. So this step can be the hardest thing for a beginner to understand, and you will learn it as you play the game. But there are still good resources out there, like different YouTube channels, or if there's a subreddit for your faction, you can go out there and there'll be people talking about different combinations that are good for different detachments. And um, unless you're just like a savant, you can read the stratagems and enhancements and be like, "Oh, I know how this all works." You're like Neo, and you're like, "I see the code."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
that step three can be difficult.
yeah. If you are a beginner, a complete beginner, and you have never played before, I would just recommend kind of maximizing your points, ignoring enhancements and stratagems for your first game, and just work on learning the rules. Don't worry about that too much.
Hmm. And
Um,
then should we get
the
into
one
this?
thing,
Go ahead.
so the one thing I just want to touch on this really quickly for beginners because we are kind of catering this towards beginners. We talked about leaders and how you attach them to units. You just to be aware, when you add a leader to your army, you don't have to attach them in list building phase. That is part of setup. So when you set up for the game, there's a step in the setup that says to set formations or determine your formations or whatever,
Hmm.
and that's where you take your leaders and that's when you actually attach them to uh, units that they can lead. So like for example, you could have I could have in my list Ragnar, who can lead assault intercessors in Blade Guard, and I could include both a unit of assault intercessors and a unit of Blade Guard, but I don't have to in list building determine, okay, Ragnar's going to lead this, and that's how I'm going to run the list. If I get into a matchup where it makes sense for him to lead one versus the other, I can do that at the table, which is kind of nice. So what I'm trying to tell you is during the list building phase, you can kind of plan to attach them, but you don't actually have to say in the list building phase, this leader is going to lead this and this leader is going to lead that.
Hmm. You should have different plans in mind, like you're saying, where if they can be attached to multiple units, you can think of, oh, it would be useful to attach my war boss to the boys if I'm really care about OC and just like putting bodies on an objective. Or I have this unit of 5 knobs where they could go in and they work as a scalpel unit where they could just tear something right off the board. So it's useful to think about those types of things when you're putting those different types of units in your list. So the last step, step 4, is probably the one that people will spend the most time on when you're making a list. Some people hate it because they feel like they can't make a decision on this part, but I think this is the most fun part. So this part is balancing your list. So this is where you really want to evaluate the unit composition of your list. Um, and we highly recommend for new players, beginners, to try to build balanced lists, because what a balanced list will do for you is it'll give you the different tools that you need to be able to react to different situations when you're playing against different lists. Um, if you don't have enough of a specific type of unit, it could hurt you. So, like, the different types of units we're talking about are, for one, like, you want to have durable units versus high damage output units. So, you need stuff that's going to be able to tank some damage, maybe be the focal point of your enemy for a turn, where it enables the rest of your army to kind of go do its thing. But on the flip side of that, you want to have high damage output units where you can take out your opponent's durable units. What are some other things to consider with balance, Brooke?
Yeah, so balanced lists, while having durable and high damage output, they also have units that can play the objective and units that have high mobility. Um, for objective play, a lot of those units are in your battle line section. They typically have higher OC, which is your objective control, and they're typically durable enough to survive on an objective for a little bit. And then the other part of that is mobility, which can come in the form of transports, so you can get your army where they need to quicker. Or if you have a unit that can move very fast, like a flying unit or jump assault intercessors, they can move 12 inches, something like that. That is very fast. Those units can help you run late game objectives, or they can help you run secondaries over the course of the game by getting to where they need to be, and maybe they perform an action or they just need to get to your opponent's deployment zone. The mobility aspect is kind of underrated, but I think it's very important for a balanced list.
Mm-hmm. And I think you'll find as you're choosing your units that some units will check multiple of these boxes, which they can be very useful to run in your army. And just always consider that when you're looking at a unit. Just think, what does this bring to my list? Is this a damage dealer? Is it a tank? Is this just an action monkey who's going to do objectives for me, mobile, whatever? Consider those things, and that'll help you make the decision when you're balancing. And then, at the end, when you feel like you have your list, you can just kind of tally what you have, and in your head, decide, do I have enough mobility? Am I going to be able to perform some of the weird secondary objectives that require me to go to the different quadrants of the board and the board edges and stuff like that? Or if I need to react to moving over to another primary really quickly, do I have the mobility for that? Or do I even have the OC to just take an objective away from my opponent? Do I have enough battle line stuff? So the amount that you need could differ depending on the meta and stuff of your local play group, or if you're playing in a tournament or something, the meta can impact what the balance needs to look like for you. And this is, again, it's like one of the hardest parts. It's the last step to building an army. To me, it's the most fun thing because you get to make all these strategic decisions, and I can understand why some people are just like that, they get analysis paralysis and they feel like they never play a game because they're just constantly building. But you're not going to know whether or not you built a balanced list until you play with it. So don't get into analysis paralysis.
Right. And I think depending on your faction or detachment that you picked in step 2 of this, when you selected your detachment, faction, all that, it can be a little bit straightforward on having a balanced list. It might be a little bit easier for you. Like an example that comes to mind is if you play something like Necrons, your battle line is such an important unit in your army typically, like from just a more balanced, not a skewed list, just a more balanced list. You can kind of have a balanced list by just playing what is normal, and that's like, I have a big unit of Necron warriors and they move up and they stand on an objective. That's my objective play, right? I've moved up, I've kind of moved forward, I've sat on the objective, and now I'm durable enough to hold the objective. That kind of hits two of those aspects there.
Mm-hmm.
They can reanimate, they can come back from the dead after they've been killed, so they fill that part of the gameplay. So there's certain factions where your army composition is going to fit into a balanced list more often than not. Whereas if you play something like, I don't know, something like Drukhari or something like that, where their stuff is so fragile that it's hard to have a durable unit, but they are very high damage output.
Mm-hmm.
So objective play in like how you survive is a little bit different compared to something like a Necrons or Space Marines that can just kind of stand on an objective, get shot, and probably survive. Or if you're Drukhari and you are standing on an objective with your battle line and they get shot, they're probably just dead because they're so fragile that there's no way that they're going to survive that. But they have other ways to survive and run objectives. They have a lot of transport play. So it depends on your faction, depends on your detachment a lot of times too, on how you build that balanced list and how you balance those different styles of units.
Mm-hmm. So just to summarize again, so here are the steps for building an army. Step 1, you're going to pick your army size, 1,000 point, 2,000 point, 3,000 point, or something else. Listen to our last video if you want suggestions on point sizes to play. Step 2, you need to select your units and your detachment. So you need to follow the unit requirements. When selecting those units, you have to have the minimum of 1 leader, that is your warlord, and then follow the datasheet slot limits. Step 3, you choose your enhancements, so any leftover points, or if it's really important to your faction, you might want enhancements for your characters that just give them a little extra buff. And then the last step is balancing your list, so making sure that you have the right composition to react to whatever your opponent throws at you in the game. So that
Right.
is a lot to do when you're building a list. Luckily, we don't all have to do that on paper with pencil, because we'd be erasing constantly. So we're like, I don't want that. You erase it.
Yeah, thank
So
you, Lord, because I would not play the game if I had to do that.
crumple up the paper, throw it in the waste bin. You're like, gosh, that list sucks. So we
I
have
spent all this
tools.
time writing it.
Yeah, we're human beings. We got tools for this. So um, let's talk about some of the tools that you can use to make your list building a little bit easier.
Yeah, so there's the official rules, official tools, I should say. And that's what I primarily use. The Warhammer 40K app has free rules, but if you want access to the list builder, you need to have a codex and then put that code into the codex to unlock the data sheets. If you have not received your codex and you are uh, running your army off of its index, kind of like I am, I'm in a unique situation. Space Marines are weird. But if you are running an index faction still, you don't have your codex, you have access to the list builder. You can build one list and you can see all your data sheets because they're in the index right now.
Mm-hmm.
The second part of that is there are the latest digital releases of whether it's the codexes or codexes are you have to buy them, but then there's also like that balanced data slate. There's the points updates, and those are on GW's site on the community page under the downloads.
I would say I really like their app. Being honest, I like it, but the one thing I don't like is, even if you've bought the codex, you got the code, you download the app, you can only do one list in the app at a
Right.
time, which is painful. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you got to pay, and then you can have as many lists as you want, right?
Yeah, and I'm a sucker because I pay for the subscription to have as many lists as I want because I like list building and I have
Mm-hmm.
several factions, so I don't want to be stuck to one.
I
And
I like list building too, but I'm notoriously cheap, so I don't pay for the app. But I do use it. It is good to have. If you'd never bought, listen, if you don't want to buy your codex and you're going to use rules somewhere else, you do your own thing. That's fine, but we can't endorse it because we're on YouTube. And buy your, like, if you buy your codex and you can get your one list, it's a great tool to use, especially for game night, because you're gonna know what your list is by that point in time. Put it in the GW, the Games Workshop app, and you're good to go for that night. Just, I don't recommend it for, I'm at work, I'm taking a bathroom break, and I'm sitting on the toilet with my phone. I'm gonna build a list while I'm using the restroom.
yeah,
I don't use it for that. So, but luckily, there are other free options out there. So, my favorite free option is called New Recruit. A lot of people use Battlescribe. I've used Battlescribe once in my life, and I'll never use it again, probably.
do not recommend Battlescribe. If you have used it forever, then maybe you love Battlescribe, but it is terrible as a new user.
And New Recruit is great. So it'll save your lists in the cloud. You don't have to save them locally on the device, which is great. You can put as many lists as you want. They're pretty quick about updating the rules. It seems to be like maybe 2 weeks after like a balanced data slate comes out, they'll update points, which is not bad. Um,
Sometimes it's faster than GW's app.
that's true. Sometimes they are a little bit faster. I got a really tiny, crappy screenshot on here to show you guys what the UI looks like. Um, it's not as flashy as the GW one for
It's
40K because it doesn't have pictures and stuff, but it does the job.
it sounds dumb, but the pictures in the 40K app are kind of awesome for a new player. So Bear, friend of the show, one of the things that he had trouble with at the very beginning was navigating his list on like Wahapedia or free sites like New Recruit, because he didn't know all the names of all the units. So that when we're like, oh, these are your Infernus Marines or whatever, and we had to like, oh yeah, go find your Infernus Marine data sheet. Like if he has a picture, he can go through the pictures on the GW app and just be like, "Oh, that's the guy with the flamethrower. I don't know what he's called necessarily. That's the guy with the flamethrower. Click on him, and go from there." Like it is kind of nice as a new player to have those pictures, but again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you pay for it. Definitely wouldn't recommend that. I made that decision after a while of using it for free, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna pay a little bit and get the unlock the app for myself with all the codexes I own and all that stuff. So
Mm-hmm. I,
yeah,
I
but we can go back to New Recruit though.
I think one of the most important things of these apps, though, is having an ability to export your lists. Does the GW app have that feature? I'm sure
It
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 does.
it does. It's a little I would call the exported list like bloated for what we do.
Mm-hmm.
I end up having to trim it down so I can send you a list because the list is so long and includes every single war gear option that you pick and all that stuff. And I'm just like, I just want to tell you that I have a squad of assault intercessors and there's 5 guys in that. Like
Yeah.
that's all I need to tell you. But it's like, oh, you have your sergeant and he has a plasma pistol. Then you have 4 guys and they have bolt pistols and chain swords. And I'm like, I don't like that's too much information. I wish there was like a slimmed down version I could
Mm-hmm.
do, but it is what
That
it is.
that's probably where New Recruit really shines. Is it's really good about exporting. Like I'll share my
Right.
lists with you all the time. There's like a short format one that you can share where it just has the unit name, the number of them, and like the quantity in that unit, and it's great. And the reason I feel like you want an export tool is so you can share the list with your friends, because that is another resource that hopefully everybody has who's playing 40Ks. You have other friends or a game group or whatever that is also playing 40K. Maybe there's some people who are more experienced than you. Having the ability to export and share your list with friends is going to help you build more balanced lists and things like that.
Right. And if you go to a tournament, you're going to be required to export and print out your list for the tournament. So if you might be a beginner and you're not even thinking about that, so don't worry about it. But yeah, if you are going to tournaments, you do have to print out your list.
Mm-hmm. Uh, any other tools that we need to cover? Oh, yes, there's a very important thing that we need to cover. Um, so it's not as easy to like browse different units in New Recruit, in my opinion, because it's a little annoying. I don't know if the GW app is the same way because I don't have as much experience with it. But like, if you want to look at different data sheets and for units just to like understand their rules, one of the best references for this is Wahapedia. We were just saying, you should still buy your codex, but Wahapedia is great for, exactly what I was saying before. I'm taking a break at work and I'm trying to remember a certain unit and what it does. You can look up the unit on Wahapedia and read its rules.
Yeah, Wahapedia is extremely, extremely good for a free resource to learn the core rules. It's also a great resource if you want to play something like boarding actions and you don't have the book. It has all the boarding action stuff on there. Like it's an awesome resource in general. I pay for the GW app, but I still use Wahapedia when I'm just looking stuff up. If I'm on my computer or something, I'm like, oh, I want to look at this, and I'll just go to Wahapedia. I'm not going to pull out my phone and go through the app and try to get the faction that I want to look at and all that. Like the app, don't get me wrong, the app is really nice and it is pretty easy to browse different data sheets. But I still use Wahapedia because I know how to navigate it. It's pretty easy to navigate, and it's really quick to look up data sheets for other factions that aren't the ones that you're playing.
Yeah, they like interface their search engine optimization or whatever with Google too. So you could just go to Google and type orcs, knobs, Wahapedia, and the very first thing you're going to find is exactly what you're looking for, which is great.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I respond to most of the comments on our channel, and when I'm looking up rules, I most often use Wahapedia to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't want to get out my actual book. I don't want to get out my phone and try to hunt down the rules, which is actually kind of a weakness in the GW app. Trying to find the rules in the GW app. Maybe I just don't know the right way to do it. It kind of sucks though. It's kind of trash. But on Wahapedia, it's very simple. It is laid out like the book, so it's very easy to navigate. Whereas when you're navigating it in the GW app, it's like the search bar, and trying to navigate that search bar is a pain in the butt. You're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I want to learn how like disembarking units works. And you like go to look that up, and there's like an FAQ, and there's like another FAQ, and there's like a core rule, but it's not the one that you're talking about. And then there's a different one, and you're like, I don't know which one of these I actually need to click. And you like click on 3 of them, they're not the right one. Then you finally find the one that you do, and you're like, okay, finally, like I finally found that stupid rule.
Mm-hmm.
But Wahapedia is pretty easy to navigate. It's what I
Yeah.
use most often when looking up rules, especially when I'm answering you guys.
And last thing I have to say about it is it's kind of like Wikipedia. It's you got to you can trust it but verify it. So the information
Right.
you read on there could be wrong because it's open source. And then kind of the last helpful resource, kind of something we already touched on, is your community. Whether it's a YouTube channel like our channel, if you want to talk with us in the comments, we can help you guys build lists or answer questions that you have. If you have a Discord community, which we're trying to start our own Discord community, we're going to try to get an Inwarp Mag Discord here started. Um, or if you just have a friend group that you text with, like use those as resources too to help you build better lists.
Right. You might not be considering something that one of your friends is. And like one thing I will ask Drew when I'm building lists is what do you think is more threatening? And I'll give him some options. And he's like, I think this is probably your best bet. Because like
Mm-hmm.
for me, I might be looking at it from my perspective, but if he's the one who will play me, and if I'm like, which one of these do you think is the most threatening? And he can tell me, oh, I think that's the most threatening because of the XYZ. Like, this is what I would be considering. And that's super helpful. Like, getting a different perspective on your list is always a good help.
Yeah, like last week we were list building off of each other, and you were getting a list ready, and you're like, what do you think would be good? And I was like, the Land Raider with Ragnar and other crap in it because that's terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a combo that I use a lot with Land Raider, Ragnar with Assault Intercessors, Captain with Assault Intercessors, and the Captain has Black Death. It's all within Champions of Rust. I know you might be a beginner. You might not have any idea what any of that means, but it's an awesome combo. It's super flexible. It's this rush up the board death machine where the Land Raider rushes up. It's super durable, can hardly ever get killed, and then it drops off 2 massively dangerous units that can kind of go off and do whatever they want, and they're independent of each other, so it's very flexible. Anyways,
So
it's just this like thing that I'm asking Drew about list building, and I'm asking him what he thinks about certain things, and he goes, "That is really scary." I'm like, you know what? That is pretty scary. I want to use that.
Bill, if you're listening, sorry,
True.
because he had to go against it.
Yeah. So the moving on from our tools and resources, we talked about this a little bit in the building army step by step, but we'll kind of hit on it a little bit more in depth. One of the important things to do in your list building is play test and refine your army list.
Yeah. So we kind of touched on this earlier. It's kind of, unless you're a savant and you can just read the rules and know exactly what you're reading and understand the meta, um, to us, we're not that smart. We need to play test and understand what the list does and does not do. You need to play test games, or they don't even necessarily need to be test games. Just play with your friends and don't take it so seriously. But if you're going to a tournament, obviously you want to play your list a few times before you take it to a tournament. So, what are the things that you would be looking for when playtesting? So, you're going to want to identify what works in your list, what doesn't work, and I think most importantly, you want to identify what you like in your list, as in like what brings joy to you from that list. Because ultimately, if you don't enjoy playing the list, you're going to become disengaged as you're playing the game and not play to your full potential.
Right. And as our play group knows, my favorite unit is Bjorn. And I use him in every single list because I like him that much. And
Hmm.
it's not even necessarily what works and what doesn't. It's because it brings me joy to put him on the table. And I spend a lot of time painting him. And seeing him run around the table is super fun to me. And, you know, that's part of me. That's part of me in refining my army list. I've learned that he's most often my warlord.
Yeah,
So that's important to me.
other people talk about this with list building. They call them your non-negotiables. Like Bjorn would be one of your non-negotiables. This is, to me, how you discover who your non-negotiables are. You might have a non-negotiable because the model is that cool, but until you play with them and see, like, you might think it's cool, but then it sucks on the board, and it kind of takes away the coolness factor of it because it might
It can
just
also be
be a
the
bad unit.
It could also be the opposite, and I think you've had that experience.
Yeah, so one thing, there's like a few units for me that I painted because I was like, I heard these are good, but I don't know, they're okay. So like flash kits, I talked about this in a hobby fatigue episode. I hated painting my flash kits so much, and I'm like, I'm never gonna buy these again, and I'm never gonna paint these again. And then I took them in a doubles game, and just a unit of 5 did so much work, and I was like, oh wow, these are great, and it's really nice having orc shooting. So now they're kind of one of my non-negotiables where I try to figure out how to fit some flash kits in my list because I really like taking them in a unit of 5 with a unit of 5 knobs, and then they go in a truck together, and I have this little like SWAT team in the truck. So this is how you discover little non-negotiable type things where you're like, I want to take this in my list because I really like this combination. So just like I said, I like the combination of knobs and flash kits in a truck, and the knobs obviously with the war boss. So that's like a chunk of points that I set aside a lot when I'm running like a warhorde list, for example.
Right. And I think the important part of this is as a beginner, you might have done some list building and you might have read the rules and you might have done some conceptualizing like what your strategy would be and how you'd run things and oh if I do this that would be so cool that thing I think this will work. And the important part of this is getting it to the table and trying it. You might have this plan in your head of how these things will work. Oh, this thing will never die, right? And then it dies, and you're like, "Oh my god, how? Like, I didn't think it would actually die, right?" You need to play test your list and see whether your strategy that you have in your head is actually reasonable or
Yeah.
actually will work when dice are rolling.
Mm-hmm. Like one of the units I was excited about when I first started painting was Mazrog. And this was with Index Orcs, I should say. So he was really good in Index Orcs, and I was really excited about him. But when I got him to the table and he just kind of wilted and died really quickly, I was he lost some of his coolness factor for me. I'm like, he's a really cool model, but it sucks. And like now that he's actually worse, I just I can never justify taking him in any list. He's too many points, and to make him good, you got to take other other bodyguard units, which makes him cost even more. So it's just kind of like I like him, I like the idea of him, but it just didn't really work on the table. So if I want to have a good time, like I don't want to be picking up Mazrog because he's a badass. He looks awesome.
Right.
And if he's kind of sucks, then I might sadly shelve him until the next edition, or if he gets a glam up this edition, then maybe he'll come out.
And speaking about getting glam ups or balances affecting things, it is important to adjust your list to balance updates or your local meta shifts. You don't always have to, but it is important that if you want to have a good time and you are trying to, maybe you're not playing to win necessarily. You're playing to play the cool things that you painted that you're proud of, right? And that might be more important to you than even your on the battlefield performance. But if you are worried about the performance of your list, it's important to adapt when there are balance updates. I know that
Mm-hmm.
some people in the 40K community will speak negatively about how often there are balance updates and how much the game changes. But I think we both agree that it's a healthy thing. It keeps the game fresh, and probably the most important part of that is you should cater a little bit to your local meta, just so that if your local meta has some skew or some play style that's very prevalent, and a more balanced list would just kind of get rolled by that skew, you need to shift a little bit to accommodate that so that you can also have a good time. No matter what
Mm-hmm.
your playgroup meta is, you can still have a good time regardless.
Yeah, like always consider in your head that at the end of the day, Warhammer 40K is an objective based game. You're going to win the game by scoring the most points. But like Brooke's saying, if you have some local meta where it's like very vehicle heavy or something like that, you don't want to get tabled because you can't win the primary and secondary objective game if you don't have units on the table. So you have to have stuff to deal with those things. We still would recommend for beginners, try to build a balanced list um, as far as being able to react to whatever situation happens in a game. But this is where you can start to consider some skew. Once you start understanding your local meta shifts and stuff like that, and how the balanced data slates affect the meta, that's where you might want to introduce some skew into your list, where you go, I need more things that can deal with vehicles. I need things that can throw out some dev wounds. That's where you would start considering putting some more skew into your list.
Yeah, so speaking of skew, what are some common beginner mistakes, and how should they avoid them?
Yeah, so just touching again on skewed, sometimes when you build skewed lists and you don't have a good understanding of the game, that's where you can basically create a bad time for yourself, where you take a bunch of one thing and then you run it on the table in your head. It sounds great, but it's not good. Like there could be a skewed list that's just straight up bad. It's going to lose. Um, if you're doing it just as a lull factor type thing, like, I'm going to take all dreadnoughts or something like that.
Right.
Sure, like don't expect to win the game if you're going to build a skewed list. But if you want to be, I think everybody should be playing to just like get better at the game and stuff like that. You got to be careful with skewed lists. You really need to understand what you're doing. So kind of with the skewed list, that would be like if you're relying way too much on a single strategy or a single type of unit to be like a star for your army.
Right.
What are some
Like if
other?
I was
Go ahead.
if I was running, like, I'll give you an example. Like if I was running an agents list and I relied too heavily on allying Canis Rex, which everybody seems to do, but if I'm like relying too heavily on that, then maybe the tournament meta or the local meta that I play in, they might cater their lists to deal with Canis Rex, which takes the teeth out of my agents list.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly I'm having a much worse time because my opponents were smart enough to counter my skew or my single strategy that I've been relying on since I was a beginner.
Mm-hmm.
So be flexible, have redundancy, and don't rely on a single strategy like that. Don't rely on a single unit. If you put all your points into one single superstar Death Star unit, and that unit gets killed, well, suddenly the game is over. You probably lost by the end of turn 3, right? So
Mm-hmm.
have redundancy, have other options that if you do lose that star unit, it's not the end of your game.
Yep. And another mistake, which I already touched on, is you need to remember that this is an objective based game. It's fun killing units, but if if you kill a bunch of units, then you look at the total score and you lost like 80-20. That doesn't feel good at the end. You're just like, I'm doing stuff, but like I'm performing poorly. And unless you
Right.
don't care about that final result and you just want to kill stuff, that's up to you. But I like to try to win the game, or for new players, don't focus so much on the final result as far as win loss, but just you want to focus on maximizing your points.
Making progress game to game.
Yeah, so like even if you're losing, but you feel like you're maximizing your points, eventually the wins are going to start coming in for you.
Right. I think one of the important things for beginners, kind of talking about the objectives, is you need to not ignore board control and mobility. One of the mistakes that you can make is not having enough units that can be like action monkeys, like things that will be able to do the actions that come up on secondary objectives, or things that can get to an objective and hold it, and you're not at a detriment because that unit is staying behind on an objective. Or you can have things like intercessors that can sticky an objective, and if you sticky that objective, then they can move off and help support the rest of the army.
Hmm.
But having those types of things to try to establish board control is extremely important as a beginner. If you have all these glass cannony, super fast, I'm going to rush this at my opponent and try to kill them, and if that unit dies because it doesn't have much durability, doesn't have much board control presence kind of thing, like it's not going to stay on the board very long. Once that thing dies, your opponent's just going to move up the field and take the objectives from you, and it doesn't
Hmm.
matter what you have left at that point, because you spent so many points on trying to just kind of rush them and kill them.
Yeah.
Having that board control, establishing your battle lines is very important, and the other side of that is mobility. One of the things I didn't do towards the beginning of playing 40K was I didn't like transports that much. I thought transports were kind of lame for what I wanted to do. I was like, oh, why do I want to pay 80 points for an impulsor when I could pay 80 points for another unit of intercessors or something? It's just something like that. Or at that time, I'll pay 80 points for jump assault intercessors because they're 80 points at the time.
Hmm.
Um, but having a transport that can carry your important unit up the board, that can take an objective, it can drop off this unit to go and try to attack like some offensive unit. Well, once your transport drops off its payload, it can then go and run objectives, or it can just sit on an objective in the back line, and it's still doing its job. It still has a purpose, and you have this flexible unit that maybe your opponent's not going to target because it's so non-threatening compared to one of your more offensive units, but it's still giving you points for the missions because it's running your secondaries, it's sitting on a primary. They're extremely important. That mobility to get your units into your opponent's lines and then run objectives is very important.
One thing I want to go back and touch on with like ignoring board control, going back to that real quick. Just consider this as a new player. Like if you look at Angron, for instance, let's see, he is 435 points. He's one big A model. He puts out the hurt real good. He's an intimidating force to go against. If you had to go against him, he can die and come back. Like that's how good he is. He has OC6. That's his objective control, and he's got toughness 11, saves on a 2-up, 4-up invuln, 16 wounds. The guy's a beast.
Sounds
Now,
kind of incredible.
yeah, you're like, that is great. How am I going to deal with that? And like, it's amazing because there are tools in the game to consider. This is why you don't want to ignore objective control. There are units that can counter Angron that cost 40 points. For instance, I can get a unit of Gretchen for 40 points, and if Angron is standing on an objective, I can move them onto the objective and just take it away from him without even needing to kill him because I will out OC him. And then for the next turn, I'm move blocking him too. So a 40-point unit can neutralize this big evil demon man. So don't ever ignore the usefulness of OC. It can do a lot for your list and enable the rest of your army.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on maybe past beginner concept there, but move blocking, that's kind of the part of like mobility and board control. Like move blocking can enable your army to do things while your opponent's army can't really interact with your army because they can't get to you to kill you in melee like Angron wants to, or they can't get to objectives, so they can't establish their own board control. There's just things within the game that if you dive deeper, you're going to learn these tricks on how to establish board control. You can, play the objective in a smarter way, and that sort of thing. And that's
Hmm.
definitely one of the that's a pretty ridiculous example, and it definitely is a real thing that can happen. But that's just one of the many examples of how to exert board control.
Yeah, that's where like these examples, like thinking about board control, thinking about mobility, and the just like the primary and the secondary objectives. When you're looking at other people's lists, you might see certain units where you're like, why would you take that thing? That thing stinks. Like when you look at the data sheet, it doesn't do anything in your mind, that there's nothing that stands out immediately. That's where you need to start thinking about when we were talking about building the army at the top. You got to think of that unit's role in the army. What is it enabling me to do? And having a 40-point unit that can do secondaries, it's an action monkey, it can out OC things on objectives. That's where its usefulness comes into play. And for like such a cheap amount, that's why people are taking it. So that this is stuff that will come with time, that you'll learn how these units can be used to enable you to win the game. But um, everything kind of has its use. There are a few units that are just kind of completely broken and useless, but mostly everything has a role to play in an army if you're bringing it.
The last beginner mistake I want to touch on is overloading your list with characters or very, very expensive units. And there's no room left for other units in the list. Uh, I can speak to a little bit of experience on this. As a Champions of Rust player, one of the things that you get benefits from is if your characters accomplish certain tasks over the course of the game, it unlocks your sagas. So when I first was building lists, I was like, oh, I need to have a billion characters to run all these different objectives. But not really. I don't really need to do that. I need to have some that can accomplish those objectives. But if I overload into that skew too hard, if I have too many characters or I have too many more expensive units, then I'm not going to be able to react accordingly to the objective. Or if those things die, then I don't uh, I don't have enough redundancy in my list to accomplish what I want to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other side of that too is if you have like a ton of really expensive units. So if you have um like if you're playing Astra Militarum and all you run is a bunch of tanks, right? If you just run all tanks, well, what's going to hold objectives? Are you just going to kill everything? Because that's kind of what you have to do if you run that list. You have to be able to kill everything. But if you can't, and your opponent just establishes board control, maybe they move block you, they start holding objectives, and you can't come back on the objective play, then no matter how many tanks you have, it doesn't matter because you're not going to win that game.
Mm-hmm.
Overloading on those types of things is a very easy mistake to do because you want to run all the big cool things that you just hobbied or the things that you just built, right? You want to see those really big monsters or tanks on the battlefield. But if you have too many of those and your army is skewed too much in that direction, it can create a bad experience for you just because you're not going to be able to accomplish what you want to, or you're still going to lose the game, even if those units are performing well.
Mm-hmm.
You might have wiped your opponent off the board, but that might happen by turn 4 or 5. But by that time, the game's already out of hand because they've been scoring their objectives. So
And
keep
one
those things in mind.
Yeah, one more thing about that too is there are secondary objectives that kind of incentivize against doing that, like assassinate, where somebody's going to be able to maximize assassinate because you have so many characters on the board, or
Right.
bring it down. If you got a ton of vehicles out there and maybe not a bunch of tough vehicles either, your opponent is going to be able to maximize bring it down, and you're just going to lose the game on secondaries that way.
Yeah, that's very true.
Not to mention how much you're going to be hurting yourself potentially on primary too, like you were saying. So
Right.
there are some pitfalls to avoid, but a lot of the pitfalls, like I think you'll learn those as you go. But it's good to know them so you can identify when you do them and go, oh, that is the mistake I made. Let's avoid doing that again in my next list.
Right. Well, I think we're reaching our closing thoughts here. We've touched on a lot of the important things as a beginner that you should be aware of, kind of the understanding the core components of building an army, what decisions you need to make there, the unit selection, detachment selection, stratagems, enhancements, that sort of thing. We talked about some of the tools that you can use to enable those processes to be a little bit easier, whether it's the GW app or New Recruit or looking up rules on Wahapedia. And then, again, it's very important that you play test and then you avoid some of these beginner mistakes that would be easy to make in your first few games.
And the one thing that we constantly are harping on this channel is we like to encourage new players and any player to just continue to experiment and learn by playing the game, because we do love hobbying too, but you're doing it ultimately, hopefully, unless you're into like Golden Demon type stuff, but you're doing it ultimately to be able to play the game, and it's important to get stuff to the table. Don't let maybe partially painted models stop you from trying them out in your next game night, as long as your play group is okay with that. I think most rational people are okay with that. So
Right.
continue to experiment, continue to learn, find what you like, which I think is the most important, because that's what's going to make you have fun. And ultimately, I think we all want to be good at what we're doing, because it isn't fun to sink a bunch of time into something and then be horrible at it or something like that. That just doesn't
Right.
feel good. So you get better by practicing and by learning constantly.
Yeah. And, all of this, when we get into kind of the beginner mistakes and play testing and all that, we are giving you advice, and not all of it is going to be applicable necessarily to you and your play style or your army and your faction. But, do take consideration of those things. But some of those things might not be to your play style or how you like to play the game. And if that's the way you like to play the game, then that's what's most important. You're having fun, your play group's having fun. That is the important part of this.
hmm And, if you guys enjoyed this video, then, go ahead and leave us a like, leave a comment. Like, if you have questions about list building that we didn't cover in this, or if there's something specific that applies to your game group, leave a comment, and we'll try to engage. It's usually Brooke who engages. I'm more of the like channel art guy, so that's what I work on a lot. But Brooke's really good about reaching back out to you guys.
Yeah, if you guys have comments, you need help, or you want to talk about something else related to 40K, then leave a comment. I'm happy to talk about those things. Um, yeah, I like to engage with you guys. If you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them to the best I can. I'm only one person to try to answer some of these rules questions, but I do my best to help you guys.
Yeah, I have more analysis paralysis with replying to a YouTube comment than I do with list building.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
And we did talk about this a little bit. We are planning on having our Discord server go live to the public, and if we do that in the near future, I will be more than happy to interact with you folks on there. I know Drew's probably going to be a little shy to talk to people on Discord, but
Maybe I'll
if we
open
do
up.
that, if we do that, and you guys want to talk about stuff in that channel, then once we get that live, I'd be more than happy to talk with you guys.
Yeah, and we're trying to structure our Discord so it can foster like little groups for this type of discussion, where if you want to talk about strategy and list building type stuff, you could talk about that. But if you're busy doing your own solo hobby night and you want to kind of have a community that you can do your hobby night with, which is something we've talked about in previous videos, it can be a community for you to have people to hobby with, share progress, and we have like a live chat too, that if you wanted to just join and like chill and talk with people while you're hobbying, we have a chat room for that. So I think it can be a really cool community if we can build it up.
Yeah, definitely. So, like if you liked it, comment if you want to comment, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Later, guys.